Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Hero Worship, which is episode 11 of season 5 of Star Trek Next Generation. And it's also what I'm referring to as part 2 of 4 of the Stretch of Boring. That is, in my opinion, 4 incredibly boring episodes in a row in season 5 of TNG. So this is continues the boringness that was started in the previous episode. So this video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation one episode at a time. In this video I cover the 5th season episode Hero Worship. So Hero Worship is the episode where the Enterprise discovers a ship that's been destroyed and they find one lone survivor, a 11 or 12-year-old boy whom Data rescues from the rubble, and they beam back to the Enterprise, and he insists that their ship was attacked by some aliens, and meanwhile he's traumatized by the loss of his parents and the loss of his ship. So he starts to emulate Data since Data feels no emotions, and Troi encourages this and tells Data to help make him the best android that they can. In the meantime, they discover that the boy was lying, that there's no possible way there was aliens that attacked their ship, and so they confront him, and he thinks that he destroyed the ship by pressing a button accidentally, but they reassure him that's not the case, but still don't know what actually destroyed the ship. And meanwhile they're inside this black cluster or whatever, and there's waves hitting the Enterprise and it's in danger of being destroyed. The kid says that it sounds very familiar, like exactly what happened on the other ship. And so the Enterprise Picard keeps trying to raise the shield and get more power to the shield, and then the boy keeps insisting that that's exactly what his crew did: more power to the shields, warp power to the shields. And so Data figures out that it's their own shields that is causing the shock waves, and that they need to lower their shields, which they do, and the Enterprise is saved. And then the boy stops emulating Data and returns to be a human boy, and Data promises to remain his friend. So, first thing I will say about this episode right at the front is that this kid, the actor, is too old to play this character. The way that this young boy is written, he is written like a 5 or 6 year old. I might buy 7, 8's pushing it, definitely not 9 or 10. Yeah, the boy appears to be either 11 or 12 years old when he's behaving like a 6-year-old. The whole imitating Data thing, the whole accidentally pressing a button and thinking that he destroyed the ship. I just don't buy these for a 12-year-old. Like 12-year-olds are smarter than that. So he comes off as stupid, but really, like I would have bought this as a 4 or 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, but and so the character overall is written like a 6-year-old and yet has the appearance of a 12-year-old. And so out of curiosity, I looked up the actor who played Timothy. Where was he his name was Joshua Harris, and he was born in November of 1978. And this episode was made in early 92, either early 92 or late 91, which means he was 13 years old and going on 14. Yeah, so they got a 13-year-old to play a character that should have been played by a 5-year-old. And to me, this kind of is this is a whatchamacallit, a linchpin in the episode. This is something that can't be excused. It's not something that I can look past. It kind of makes the whole house of cards of the episode fall apart, when you have a character behaving like a 5-year-old but looking like a 13-year-old. But anyway, Joshua Harris apparently, after doing a few more TV shows, left acting to be a baseball player, and he actually played for the major leagues, and he played for the Cubs for a couple of years, which is amazing. And after his sports career, he went back to film and television, but this time as a director producer. So he's currently like directing or producing a lot of like documentaries and nonfiction shows and movies, which is really interesting. But anyway, so apparently even before he did this role, he was on like Twin Peaks or something, and he had done acting since he was 6, but he wasn't 6 in this episode, which he should have been. God damn it! Or they should have gotten a 6-year-old. But anywho, and so there's actually a thing about child actors in Star Trek. Star Trek, particularly Next Generation, is not always good at casting child actors. Now, I do realize it is harder to work with children. That is a common known trope in the film and television business, that you never work with kids or animals. This reminds me of how Brent Spiner said the worst actor he ever worked with was Spock. He's like, he was a terrible actor. Couldn't stand working. He didn't get any of his beats right or anything. Anyway, so it is typically hard to work with kids, to be fair. And so maybe they do try their best, but I'm sorry, I think they should try harder. Whenever there's like kids on TV, and plus like season 5 wanted to do a whole bunch of episodes with kids, and they don't have a track record of getting good child actors, so maybe that's not such a good idea. Like in season 1, there was the episode When the Bow Breaks, when Deep Throat from the X-Files captured a bunch of kids, and most of them were terrible actors. And like Will Wheaton stood out as like a great actor compared to everyone else that was around him. And then there was what else was I thinking of? So the first kid who played Alexander in Reunion was terrible, which is why they recast him with an older actor, because apparently, and they said this, and I suspect this is exactly why they hired a 13-year-old to play a role that should have went to a 6-year-old, is because they said it is much, much harder to work with 5 and 6-year-olds. That for one thing, there's more laws protecting them, so they can only be on set for a very short amount of time, and typically they're not that good at acting. So, yes, that's probably why they got an older kid to work with. That's why they aged up Alexander, for example, because so they could work with a kid who was better. And they just came up with the bull BS excuse that, Klingons age faster. That's why, he's 2 years old, but yet he looks like he's 8 or 9, which is a bit ridiculous. But it's because they don't like working with younger actors, and as I said, I could see because they don't have a very good track record of doing so. And then there's the episode Rascals, where they have 4, and granted, these were like played by like preteens or teenagers, like they were probably range from 11 to 14 years old. It's just my guess, I didn't look it up. And yet they were all terrible, except for the young actress who played Guinan. She was actually really good, but apparently that's because they got the same actor who played Whoopi Goldberg as a younger person in Sister Act. And so she already had experience playing a younger Whoopi Goldberg, and so she did a really good job. But the rest of them... Now, Keiko one barely appeared in the episode, so you can excuse her, but the one who played Ro was just awful. Just awful. Like, one of the worst child actors. I just could not take her seriously or buy her as bro. And then there was the one who played Captain Picard. Are you here to relieve me of duty? Like, he was just terrible. He was just terrible. Not as bad as the Rogue one, but still bad. But I'll get to this more when I cover that episode. And then there's the episode Imaginary Friend, which is an interesting take on that because you had two child stars who were both the star of the episode. One was Claire, who was the main girl who lived on the Enterprise, and that actress was actually really good, especially for a child actor, which is probably why they brought her back to do shadow play over in DS9. But the other actor who played the imaginary friend, Isabella, was terrible. Absolutely terrible. Now, as far as Joshua Harris goes for Timothy in this episode, hit and miss. Like, certainly not as bad as some of the other bad child actors they had. Oh, I didn't even mention Disaster, where most of those, like, I watched a review where someone was pointing out how one of the kids kept looking into the camera. And yeah, the one who played the girl was okay, I think, but the other two were not so good. But anyway, yeah, Joshua Harris's Timothy was off and on. I think he did some scenes really good. Like, I think he did the stuff where he's imitating Data. Those were done really well. I think his acting is really good in that scene. Where I think his acting completely falls apart is the emotional stuff. Like, for example, at the end, when they confront him about how he's lying about the ship being attacked, he's still insisting they were attacked, but eventually he breaks down. He's like, I did it, I destroyed the ship, and he starts crying, and yeah, not really good about acting tears, I'm afraid. I didn't really buy that performance. It felt really fake with him trying to cry, but again, you gotta give some child actors a bit of leeway, and he at least did the other parts of the episode okay. Now, speaking of episodes with kids, as I said, this is like an indie trope that a lot of indie films and shows do, or like art house films. Is the biggest trope is having like an old person with a kid, because yeah, those are the two tropes in art house films. I noticed this in film school because we did two huge short films at the end of the year as like professional short films that were shown in festivals, and one was about an old person. Actually, they were both about old people. But yeah, so art house films, indie films always focus on either old people or kids, usually kids becoming friends with an adult, not just a bunch of kids playing, or it's not meant for kids. It's just an art house artsy film about a kid who's usually suffering from trauma and he makes friends with an adult. Or you could do the crowning achievement of indie films and have a young kid make friends with an old person. I know this isn't really considered a art house film, but I'm thinking of the Pixar film Up, which actually was the first Pixar film showed at Cannes Film Festival, and that makes sense because it's can be considered art house because it's about a young kid making friends with an old person. But there's plenty of movies like that. But as far as TNG goes, Cost of Living is when they had the crowning achievement of having a young kid make a friend with an old person. But I'll get to that when I get to that. But yeah, season 5 in particular, I just mentioned a whole bunch that focus on kids. We had New Ground, we have this episode, we have Cost of Living, we have Imaginary Friend, and I think there's some other ones that I'm not thinking of, but maybe they only did it 4 times, but still, it seems like they were going back to this well a lot in season 5 because they wanted to make it more drama based, and so they went back to the art house cliches to say, we're a serious drama show now. But yeah, I don't think it actually particularly works. Here's the problem with this episode and why I call it boring, and I stand by the fact that it is boring, even though it tries to deal with very serious matters such as a kid suffering a serious trauma and disassociating in order to deal with that trauma. Like, they can't deal with the emotions, so they just block it out, which is a very serious topic, and it's a worthwhile topic for a fictional show like Star Trek to make commentary on. The problem is, I don't think it's executed particularly well in this episode. And my main gripe with it is that, so the trauma that Timothy is going through, I mean, he was on a ship that was destroyed and he was trapped in rubble, so that by itself is very traumatic. But on top of that, he lost his parents, which should be the main trauma that he's suffering and trying to suppress, yet it's barely mentioned in this episode. In fact, the first couple times I saw this, now granted I was 12 years old myself, I was actually younger than the actor who played Timothy, but anyway, the first couple of times I watched this episode, I didn't even catch on to the fact that his parents died. And then, so when I was thinking back on this episode and trying to remember it, I some kid was trapped in the ship that was destroying, but I didn't even remember his parents were dead. And as I was watching it, I was like, wow, that's a big deal. His parents died. And so I was looking at how often they're going to bring this up, allude to it, or mention it, and it's barely at all. Like, the only times I recall is at maybe one time when Troi is talking about him to Picard or Data, she might mention, he lost his parents. And Data, when he's talking to Geordi, asking him for advice, he mentions, Timothy doesn't have his parents to help him out or whatever. And then at the end of the episode, once Timothy stops acting like an android, he says, I miss my parents. But that's not really enough, because they don't really hit home just how traumatizing and how tragic it is that he lost his parents. It feels like it's kind of like a side, like, trivial detail, that the main point is he was in a ship that blew up and was destroyed, and that's what's traumatizing him, not the fact that his parents are both dead, which I think that should have been the main focus. And instead, they don't focus on that. Instead, they focus on, isn't it cute that he's imitating Data? Oh, look at this. He's like, get his hair slicked back, and he's doing the head movements and everything, and he acts like he doesn't want to eat because androids don't eat, but he sees an ice cream sundae, and it's like, actually, we do like to taste things. Isn't that cute? And I think that actually does the episode a disservice. It comes off as a sort of silly, comedic, look at how cute it is that he's imitating Data, rather than his fucking parents are dead. And he's traumatized. He was trapped under rubble. And I'm not saying he needs to be crying throughout the whole episode. In fact, the storyline of him pretending to be an android in order to not feel anything is actually really clever, but they still need to hit home on the fact of the tragedy that he suffered. And that's why I would make a comparison to another TNG episode that actually handled this same topic a lot better, and that is the third season episode, The Bonding. In fact, for a while I didn't really like The Bonding either, until recently when I really started to analyze and look at it, and I started to appreciate it a lot more, to the point where now I think it's a pretty good episode. Because The Bonding, well, first of all, one thing that I think was missing from Hero Worship was we don't actually see Timothy's parents, and we don't see Timothy before the accident, and I think that would have really helped the episode. So I feel disconnected from Timothy because I'm just being told it's tell not show. I'm being told that he lost his parents and told he was in an accident. I think it would have been way better if we actually saw it. And they don't have to show too much of it. They could just show the very tail end with Timothy on the ship talking to his mom or whatever and saying, "Oh, your dad's on the bridge, blah blah blah," and then the ship like rocks and it starts, and they still don't understand what's going on, so they could keep the mystery. Although you would kind of know they weren't attacked right away, but still, I think that is a sacrifice that would have helped the show. And the fact that would have added an extra layer to it if you knew from the start that Timothy was lying about being attacked, but you don't understand why. Or maybe you see his arm hit the panel and him going, "Oh no, I destroyed the ship," so then you do know why. But maybe not. Maybe I think it would be better if they didn't actually have him say, "Oh no, I did destroy the ship." It would have been better to just have his arm hit the panel and then him immediately get called under rubble. And so it's kind of implied that he thinks he destroyed the ship, but then you realize this later on when he makes his confession. I think that would have actually gone a long way to get me involved in this episode. And this is a common criticism of mine, granted, because I said this similar thing about the movie First Contact, and this is also a reason why I much prefer the special edition of Aliens to the theatrical release, because we actually get to see Newt and her parents and the colony before the aliens took over, and I think that added so much more. So this might just be a personal taste kind of thing. This is my personal what I like to watch from movies. I like to see the full story because that makes me feel more invested and more involved in the characters, especially if there's a major event that's determining the whole plot of the story. It shouldn't occur off screen. Anyway, so back to the bonding. They actually showed Mahler Astor die. Now, they didn't show her die. They showed her right after she was dead. But still, we hear Picard talking to Worf over the comm, and Worf is like, "Oh, danger, blah, blah," and then they beam him up, and then we see Mahler Astor dead. Even that little bit was very helpful and much better than what this episode did. Like, that gets me more involved in the storyline. And then on top of that, like, we saw they had scenes with like Data talking to Riker about how people are affected by others' death and how come people are affected by some deaths more than others. And you had like Troi talking to Wesley about comparing it to when his father died and asking him to speak to Jeremy Astor and him not being sure he wants to do that. And then you have Worf, being upset that this person died on his watch. And so they're really hammering home the tragedy of losing a parent and just how terrible that is. Where this episode, it's like, oh, look at how cute the little boy is trying to imitate Data, and does not at all hammer home the tragedy that is at the center of the episode. In fact, as I say, you don't need to take away the fact that he's trying to block out the trauma, because actually Jeremy Astor did the same thing in the bonding. He just didn't act like an android to do it, but he still was pretending that everything was okay. He's like, "Yes, sir, I understand, sir," and not really letting his emotions go. And the episode resolved when he finally let the emotions in and let it out that he was pissed off at Worf that he lived where his mother died, and so that was the resolution. So that was similar, but again, that episode did it way better. And this kind of gets to my overall feeling that I think season 3 was way better than season 5. I'm just noticing that going back and forth between the two seasons is that I notice there's a drop in quality when I get to season 5. Maybe that is just my humble opinion, but I think comparing these two episodes is a big shining example on why this episode didn't work where the bonding did. But the one thing good about this episode is that Troi was very good in this episode. Which, as I talk about, is not something that happens very often. A lot of writers don't know how to write for Troi, and this is the second episode in the row we got where she was written for very well. That she comes off as kind of an expert counselor, and I like the way that she deals with Timothy, and she doesn't like try to be like, you're not an android, you idiot. Of course she wouldn't do that. It's a train. But the way she handles this, I'm like, oh, really? Then what's it like being an android? And also the way she talks to Data and coaches Data. And it's like, because Data, of course, doesn't understand human behavior at all. And she has to kind of coach him on how best to get Timothy to do what's best for his emotional state. And so that's a very interesting concept. So that is the one bright thing about this episode that I think was done correctly. Now another little side thing that this episode made me think about is the honest trailer for Star Trek Next Generation. That was done by Dan Murrell back when he was with Honest Trailers. The whole thing went to shit after he left, but at the time he was a huge Star Trek Next Generation fan, so he did an Honest Trailer. Anyway, I'm always reminded of it in this by this episode because there was a montage that he did with every time Data said, "I'm an android." And I remember, I think it started with him saying it in this episode because, Timothy's like, oh, are you saying that you don't really want to be an android? And his response is, I am an android. And that's what they started at. And then they had him all these other clips of him saying, I am an android, I am an android, I am an android. And then they had like a split screen with like 12 different screens going at the same time and all saying, I am an android at the same time. Didn't realize that he said he was an android that much. But anywho, as I've been talking about a lot in the episodes I've been covering, particularly Season 5, this is another major flaw in Season 5, is the A-plot, B-plot, where the A-plot is a character story and the B-plot some throwaway and unbelievably bullshit that nobody cares about. That's just there. It serves no functional purpose other than let's create suspense. And it's usually a throwaway anomaly or technology that it's not really interesting. The writers don't care about it, therefore the audience has no reason to care about it. It's just there to take up space. And because Star Trek Next Generation doing A-plot, B-plot is nothing new. They've been doing it since Season 1, but it's the specific formula of having a character story as an A-plot and the B-plot being some throwaway bullshit that's just there to create suspense. And it's usually an anomaly or some like freaking technology or something. And so I've been counting down how many times Season 5 did this. Because they started in Season 4. Season 4 was the first season to do this. Which, again, is another reason why Season 3 is better than Season 5. Because Season 3 didn't do this at all. And when it did A-plot, B-plot, they were both connected, or they were both equal, or they were both good. They didn't just have, let's throw in some anomaly BS in order to create suspense and for no other purpose. But they did this 3 times in Season 4, and I'm counting down how many times they do it in Season 5. I'm up to number 3, so I'm not even halfway through Season 5, already up to the same number that Season 4 had. So I think that Season 5 is going to be the worst season out of any season in Star Trek in regards to this B-plot anomaly bullshit. And to be fair, in this episode is kind of connected to the main story because it's what caused the tragedy that caused Timothy to, be traumatized, and it is resolved at the end with Timothy. This is how Timothy's character story is resolved by him, discovering what really happened and helping Data to overcome it. So they were somewhat connected, but I'm still counting it as throwaway anomaly bullshit because nobody cares about this dark black cluster nebula or whatever the fuck they're calling it. Like, it's just nobody cares about that. And nobody cares about the things are reflecting off the thing and the technobabble. And they had to technobabble their way out of it. Tons of freaking technobabble. Oh, technobabble this and technobabble that. And it's just... So yeah, it's definitely a throwaway B-plot, but that nobody gives a shit about. But here's another point about this. At the end of the episode, they kept raising the shields and putting more power to the shields, and every time they put more power to the shields, a bigger shockwave came to hit them, to the point where they really put like the power, they yanked it up all the way with warp power, and then a huge shockwave was coming towards them, and yet they were still thinking their shields would protect them, when it hadn't before. That it just caused the waves to get worse. So even without Timothy there, and without Data there, some of the other people like Geordi or Picard should have seen this correlation. It's pretty fucking obvious to me. Hey, you ever noticed how every time when we raise our shields and put more power to it, the shockwaves just come back even bigger? Maybe there's a correlation there. And not only did they not think of this, they were completely oblivious to this when Data pointed out and dropped the shields, and Riker's like, that's suicide, Data, and everyone's like, what are you crazy, we're about to be destroyed. I'm like, you idiots, isn't it fucking obvious that your shields are actually just powering the thing? And plus, you already know that it reflects back what you do. So they come off as morons in this ending. Now, another thing interesting to note about this episode is that it is the second time that the Breen are mentioned. The Breen were just casually mentioned in the episode The Lost. Just Data was naming all the races that Betazoids can't read, and he named the Breen. And then the Breen were suspected to be the attackers that Timothy was talking about, because apparently they don't really know much about the Breen and what they look like, but they know that the Breen has, their space is nearby. So they're like, oh, it's probably the Breen. So the Breen were pretty much like a running joke. Because, it was The Lost, it was this episode, then there was Interface in Season 7 where Picard's like talking to an admiral or something and just mentions them. And then in Star Trek Generations, Riker's listing off all the species that use disruptors that could have done the damage, could have killed that people in the starbase, and he said the Romulans, Klingons, or Breen. And then I think there was a Voyager episode where they casually mentioned the Breen, and I think they were casually mentioned early DS9 as well. So it was kind of like a running joke of, let's mention this same alien race over and over again, but not actually see them. But eventually, Ira Steven Behr decided, well, no, let's actually show the Breen. So they showed the Breen in Season 4 DS9 episode called Indiscretion. And they didn't want to spend their makeup budget to create a new alien, so they just put them in helmets. And then that's how it would go going forward until all the way up in Discovery, the latest season of Discovery, that explores the Breen more and actually shows you what they look like underneath the helmets. So that's very interesting, that especially seeing how important they are to Discovery, which from my perspective is got 2 more episodes left to go in the final season, that it started with just as a joke of them just naming an alien that we never see. But yeah, that was quite interesting. Anyway, I would now like to thank all those that support me on Patreon. It is very much appreciated. It does help me continue with my channel, and so I'm very thankful to all that support me. I would like to give a very special thanks to Brandon Neilhouse for all your support throughout the years. Thank you so much. But I also want to give a shout out to Antarius, Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Matty Jester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Miguelicio, Norman Buchwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, and Allison Fordyce. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So, we got a few patron comments on this episode. First comment is from Ricky, who says, "This puts me to sleep every time I watch this episode. I've just realized how many episodes there are that feature children being part of the episode's story, but in this case it was so boring and slow and uninteresting I get it that the kid went through a traumatic experience, and acting like Data and imitating him in every way was so uninteresting. The one thing that I remember most about this episode is the behind the scenes. This episode was the episode where Gene Roddenberry passed away during the filming of production, and supposedly it took a massive toll on the cast members, and everybody wasn't at their best performance, supposedly. So my rating is a 2 out of 10. I could actually definitely see the effects of the actors not being at their best. Except for, and apparently Marina Sirtis was hit really hard by Roddenberry's death, and she talked about like going to her trailer and crying. But her performance seems to be the best in this episode. I don't know what it is with that. Anyway, next comment is from Stephen Kennedy, who says, I will be brief with my comment on this episode as I don't want to divulge too much information. For some reason, I gave this an average rating in the past. The split personality aspect hits a little too close to home for me in the past. Many years ago, I had to see a counselor as I knew I needed help with something, so now I can completely relate to Timothy's mental state of trying to block out bad memories. Maybe this is the main cause of my insomnia, why I love horror. I don't really get scared watching horror movies, and I read books about real-life serial killers. However, the movie Event Horizon got to me as my heart was still racing for about 30 minutes after the film ended. The Descent also got to me big time. This may be funny to some people, but I can't play the video game Resident Evil for more than an hour as I tend to get a shiver up my spine. My rating is 8. This is the third episode in a row that Deanna Troi is great in, and her reward for this is the next episode, which I may not comment on and may just give my score only out of 10. That's completely valid. It's completely valid that that you can relate to this episode in that way. And no, you don't have to go into any more detail than you want. But it's interesting that you say this is why you like horror, so that may explain like the differences, because I personally don't like horror because I just see the tropes. Like, I don't actually feel scared. You said you didn't feel scared either by most horror stuff, but that seems to be the point of horror movies. Whenever I watch a typical horror movie, I just see the tropes, and it just makes me groan, like, yeah, this trope, that trope, and of course that's going to happen. There's a jump scare, and there's the people that die, and there's the one that survives, and and that's why I typically don't like horror movies. I'm more of a fan of thriller movies, which I actually do find that get my heart pumping, like A Quiet Place, for example, or Aliens, which is more of an action horror. But as far as Event Horizon goes, I also had similar experience seeing that movie. I remember me and my friends saw it, and we were really freaked out afterwards, and we were purposely fucking with each other. Like, we were like jumping out of corners going, boo, and scaring the shit out of each other, because we were all kind of rattled by that movie. But the reason why is because we were all on LSD when we saw it. So that probably had a major factor in it. And looking back on that movie and watching it later when I was sober, I kind of realized that I think the first part of the film is very eerie and very effective. Like, when they're listening to recording of everyone going crazy and ripping their eyes out and saying, "Save yourself from hell." Like, that is creepy as fuck. But then halfway through the movie, when people start dying off, it just turns into a very typical horror movie where, oh no, there's this scary monsters going around killing people, and then Sam Neill rips his eyes out and goes, the ship won't let you leave. Then it gets silly, and it becomes more of a tropey horror, and that's when it loses me. In fact, since you bring up Resident Evil, well, you brought up the video game, but I will bring up the movie, which was directed by the same person who directed Event Horizon. I feel a very similar way about the movie, the first Resident Evil. All the sequels are just garbage. But anyway, the first one started out really scary, like really creepy. That scene that shows like this office building AI going around like killing everyone that works there. That stuff nightmares made it. That creeped me the hell out. That was a very effective, very creepy sequence. But then it starts to become like a zombie film and then you bring in all this typical horror tropes and it has like the same thing, and then the movie loses me. But that's just my humble opinion on horror movies. Anyway, next comment is from Norman Buchwald, who says, this episode is remembered as bland by critics and includes the problem of children in episodes in TNG, especially since this episode reminds one in many ways of The Bonding just 2 seasons before. In my viewing, I saw this one first, and even with that association, I found it too run-of-the-mill, like a writer's room saying, wouldn't it be neat if a kid wanted to imitate and be like Data? Never mind that how they got there was to create the second, or counting Barash, really the third orphan in this series that will once again never be heard of ever again after this episode. Speaking of lack of continuity, this episode would have been stronger if it reminded us of Lal, and that rather than Data seeming to take a sort of egocentric liking of the kid wanting to imitate him, and him seemingly bummed that the kid is no longer doing so at the end. If this was his second opportunity to be guardian to a kid, that would have made this episode quite strong rather than, I don't know, yet another anomaly of the week type of thing, as the revelation with the kid believing he pushed the button and made it all go bad. Once again, Troi is great in this episode. Yes, when she is a counselor, and especially with the children. And yes, I believe this was the first mention of the mysterious Breen in this episode. But otherwise, this episode comes across as average. It's a challenge for TNG in general to have not only guest character-centric episodes, but when they are a child, and the actor wasn't bad, but he wasn't that great either. That and The Bonding was actually a stronger episode, and this truly pales in comparison. And finally, to try to focus on Data, a character, and what he learned as a Guardian, not much there. And there should have been, as we saw how great a parent he was with Lal. Not Data has an ego, but he won't admit it. The kid is now acknowledging the loss of his parents. Truly, it would have been more phenomenal where instead Data's task was done, that Data was now there for him, not as a hero, but as a friend and a guardian. Sigh. I'll give it 5 Android fans out of 10. Yeah, I saw this episode before I saw The Bonding as well. I think it was like years later, or at least 1 year later, that I saw The Bonding, and this is one of the first ones I saw. And so I also found this episode incredibly boring. I still do, actually. When I've probably more boring now. I can appreciate some of it now as an adult, where I just found it boring as hell when it first came out. But yeah, I think you make a really good point about Data, how this episode could have been better if they portrayed Data as more of a parent, and that they mentioned Lal. This is something I did, from my perspective, just did a live stream about The Offspring, where we talked about how it's kind of sucked that they never really referenced this episode again, and that this should have impacted Data going forward. So I think this is another example where they could have brought up Lal and how Data kind of wanted to have a second chance of being a father, and that would have been an interesting spin on it. But instead, it was like, ooh, look how cool it is, he's imitating Data, which I think is the absolute wrong way to take it. By the way, one thing I wanted to mention is I do buy that the kid would imitate Data, although, again, he's a bit too old. But I buy it because I had a friend back in elementary school who did a similar thing. Like, he didn't suffer trauma or anything, and he didn't actually say that he was an android, but we were reading this book. I can't even remember, some, for kids book that we'd read in school. It wasn't like a child's book. It was more like a, not quite young adult either. It's more aimed at like a Hardy Boys type, but it wasn't Hardy Boys, but it was the same kind of thing. And it was about a teenage boy who was an android, and his name was Chip. Get it? Chip. And so I had a friend who loved these books so much that he changed his name to Chip. And he, as I said, he didn't say he was an android, but sometimes he would imitate and be like boop bop bee or whatever and kind of act like an android. But he knew he wasn't one. He didn't say that he was one. But he did change his name to Chip. So that always reminded me of that. Anyway, we'll get to their final comment, which is from Antarius, who says, and again, in the same pattern of a character story, which is quite okay, and a space anomaly B plot, but this time at least both plots are better integrated than in the last couple episodes. The solution simply to drop the shields was not a satisfying ending, but better than a lot of Voyager-style technobabble. Of course, we never see this boy again. You get the impression that the plan for him is to remain on the Enterprise, but much more logically, he would go to some kind of children's home. So the promise of him and Data staying friends seems kind of empty. My rating is a 6 out of 10. Yes, I do agree that the promise of them remaining friends is rather empty, and there's not much to it. But I think surely he has some relatives that would still be alive on Earth or somewhere else, maybe a colony or something, because his parents must have had brothers or sisters or cousins, or maybe he has grandparents. I'm sure he must have a relative to take care of him. And this could have been the same thing with Jeremy Astor, because people kind of assumed that he stayed on the Enterprise as Worf's son, but then never saw him again. But I never got that impression. They were doing the bonding, I think, was more symbolic thing. But I got the impression that as soon as they went to a star base, they dropped him off there and he went back to Earth or wherever and lived with relatives. That's what I always assumed. And some people said Worf's parents, but what? No, surely he would have relatives of his own that he would go stay with. So that's what I assume. Barash is the only example where he definitely didn't have any relatives because his whole species was wiped out. So I don't know what they did with Barash. Maybe he got sent to a kid's home. Riker's like, to me, you'll always be Jean-Luc, and then we never see him again. So I guess he won't always be Jean-Luc because he's never around anymore. But Anyway, thank you so much, patrons, for your comments. So my rating for Hero Worship out of 10 is going to be a 3, very poor. I was thinking of giving this episode a 4, but just going through just how badly they mucked up the storyline, it could have been good, but they didn't really hammer home the tragedy of it, or the trauma of it, or the fact that his parents died. Like, they barely even mentioned that the boy lost his fucking parents, which I think should be a major thing that they mention. Instead, they gave it up for, oh, isn't that so cute, he's imitating Data, which I think was the absolutely wrong way to go about it, and kind of fluffs the whole episode, and yes, makes it incredibly boring. That combined with the boring B plot anomaly bullshit that we couldn't care less about makes this a very boring episode to watch and a very forgettable episode. So that is it for my review of Hero Worship. So coming up next on my channel, let me just bring up the schedule here. So Saturday will be my review for Violations. Sunday night or Monday morning, hopefully we'll be reviewing the next episode of House of the Dragon, episode 2 of the second season. Tuesday, I'll wrap up my stretch of boring with my review of the Masterpiece Society, the most boring of the boring. And then on Wednesday, I'll be over on Patreon to cover my revisit my review of Conundrum over for my Patreon supporters. So that is what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to check it out as I continue to cover Star Trek Next Generation and many more Star Trek videos and many other videos as well. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.